Amid all the media outlets about fake news, it is easy to get carried away with sensationalist stories that are designed to inflame passions. However, fake news is not a recent phenomenon. In fact, it is as old as civilization, and it has its roots in the mainstream distribution of the printing press. My name is Shirwan, and welcome to Caspian Report. In March 1475, in the city of Trent in northern Italy, a preacher by the name Bernardine of Feltre gave sermons in which he claimed that the local Jewish community had murdered a child, drained his blood, and drunk it to celebrate Easter. As the horrifying rumor spread over the land, Prince Bishop Johannes Hinderbach of Trent exploited the situation to strengthen his authority. He canonized the murdered child as Saint Simon of Trent and attributed 100 miracles to the story. Moreover, the Prince Bishop cast blame on the city's entire Jewish community. In the process of the persecution, more than a dozen people were burnt at the stake, and the events inspired similar atrocities all over Italy. Pope Sixtus IV in Rome recognized the false story and attempted to intervene, but the Prince Bishop rejected the gesture. In fact, Hinderbach spread even more false stories about Jews feasting on the blood of Christian children. The spread of anti-Semitic rhetoric, which was already rooted in the popular prejudice of the population, was so effective that the Pope was rendered incapable of responding. This allowed for Hinderbach to evict the Jewish community from the city. A pawn had checkmated the king. This political exploitation of a false story can be credited as the start of fake news. Similar false narratives about cannibalistic Jewish rituals appeared in other major European cities and resulted in the continuous persecution of the Jewish communities. But the structure of societies profoundly changed with the introduction of the printing press in the 15th century. The movable mechanical machine by Johannes Gutenberg allowed for the unrestricted circulation of information. Within a century, literacy increased across Europe, and a new middle class emerged, which broke the monopoly of the political and religious elite. Due to the printing press, the public came to rely on leaked reports for accurate news. In Venetia, the resourceful rulers exploited the situation by purposefully leaking false reports to deceive their foes. It was one of the earliest attempts to use false stories and leaks for political gains. Only by the 17th century did European publishers start to verify sources and mention them as footnotes. Much of this was due to the trial of Galileo Galilei in 1633, which encouraged scientifically verifiable news. However, as printing expanded and news circulated more efficiently, increased self-awareness in Europe led to proto-nationalism. At the same time, fake news took on a more spectacular narrative. By the 18th century, detailed accounts of witches, sea monsters, and other unusual occurrences were frequently reported by pamphlets and prevailed in the public perception. The publishers, like the internet giants of today, did not consider themselves to be responsible for the accuracy of the content, but thought of themselves as a means of distribution. In this context, the Great Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 quickly became one of the most controversial news stories in history. The disaster had struck the city on a religious holiday. As a result, the Catholic authorities blamed the earthquake on divine retribution, while philosophers of the Enlightenment sought to explain it by rational means. In the ensuing period, the two groups competed with one another for the hearts and minds of the public by introducing their own versions of the truth. The information dispute created an entire new category of fake news, where the Church claimed that the survivors owed their lives to the grace of the Virgin Mary, while Voltaire, one of the leading figures of the Enlightenment era, disputed such narratives. These contradictory perspectives greatly confused the European societies, yet more conflicting news emerged in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War. In 1761, the French city of Toulouse experienced a major dispute when the son of Jean Calas, who was from a wealthy Protestant family, committed suicide. The local Catholic clerics spread rumors that the father had killed his son because he wanted to convert to Catholicism. The authorities acted on the false news and detained Kala, which led to his public torture. First, his limbs were stretched until they pulled out their sockets. Then he was tied to a cross where each of his limbs was broken twice. Following this, about 17 liters of water was poured down his throat. Eventually, Kala died on the breaking wheel while he firmly maintained his innocence. The gruesome and violent sentence captured the attention of Voltaire, who once again found himself at the forefront in the fight against religious fake news. The intellectual efforts by Voltaire sparked an outcry against torture and execution as well as against false stories. As a result, fake news took on a different form. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, the government's extensive budget deficit was exposed to the public. However, different political camps distributed conflicting stories. Every faction had its own pamphlets, which cited different numbers and blamed different figures. In a situation that is comparable to today, the public was left confused, and people had to rely on their own skills to figure out the truth about the country's finances. The factions that exploited the situation to their own advantage unknowingly introduced partisan media. Before long, every major political faction in Europe engaged in false narratives. Political parties would circulate pamphlets among the public to discredit their opponents with falsehoods. Even the glorified founding fathers of the United States took advantage of fake news. For instance, Benjamin Franklin embellished stories of Indians who scalped civilians and were in league with the British Empire. Such stories multiplied over the course of the American Revolutionary War, and it eventually led to the destruction of the Indian communities east of the Mississippi River. Decades later, when the British threat passed, fake news in America refocused on racial sentiments by exaggerating slave uprisings and the crimes that were committed by slaves. These sensational stories led to increasing violence against African Americans. But false stories also played a critical role in politics. For instance, during the presidential elections of 1800, pro-federalist partisan papers published stories regarding the death of Thomas Jefferson in hopes of altering the voter turnout. It became evident that the land of opportunity was also a goldmine for sensationalism. In the 1830s, as technology improved and mass production of inexpensive paper became possible, modern, non-partisan newspapers emerged. The penny press, as they were known, were cheap tabloid-style papers that covered crime, sports, comedy, and gossip. The purpose was mostly to entertain readers. Moreover, the business model of the penny press tabloids depended on advertisers as opposed to the subscription fees of the partisan outlets. This commercial plan relied on the circulation of the item, and to boost sales, the new tabloids embellished stories by adding false details. The Sun, based in New York, was one of the first penny press tabloids, and its business plan became the standard model after its circulation skyrocketed following the Great Moon Hoax. In a series of articles that was published in 1835, the newspaper claimed the discovery of an alien civilization on the moon. As the series progressed, the paper added more details to the story, and by the final episode, it introduced man-bat-like creatures that fornicated in the public. The series caused a sensation. People stood in crowds to purchase the day's edition of The Sun, and the paper's circulation surged from 8,000 to 19,000 copies. It went from a small upstart tabloid to the most widely read newspaper in the world. After the stories were revealed to be a hoax, The Sun's circulation decreased slightly, but it still remained high. This experience created the template for the tabloid papers of today, and it displays the pros and cons of the commercial strategy of fake news media and why it has re-emerged in the internet era. For a modern example, think of Breitbart News. Although most of the stories of the penny press were relatively innocent, sometimes, however, it incited violence. For instance, in 1844, an anti-Catholic newspaper in Philadelphia claimed that a local Irish gang had been stealing Bibles from public schools. The story appealed to the passion of people and led to violent attacks on Catholic churches. Such sensationalist stories continued well into the late 1800s. In the run-up to the Spanish-American War, Morning Journal, which was a newspaper that belonged to plutocrats like Randolph Hearst, fabricated stories that helped to propel the United States into a conflict. The Morning Journal claimed that Spanish officials in Cuba were committing atrocities. When the paper's correspondent in Havana wired that there will be no war, Hearst replied, "You furnished pictures, I'll furnish the war." Hearst published fake drawings of Spanish officials strip-searching American women, which at the time was considered a great injustice. The fake story inflamed the public, and Hearst got the war he wanted. This technique of using false experts, fake interviews, and exaggerated scandals to spark sympathy and rage became known as yellow journalism. In March 1913, President Woodrow Wilson invited journalists to hear him speak, which would be followed by questions from the reporters. It was the first presidential press conference. Now, it wasn't exactly fake news, but such meetings were an early attempt by governments to insert a tunnel vision in the media. Officially, the plan was to give the public an idea of what tasks the president performs. In truth, however, the concept of a news conference is to control the flow of information. By gathering journalists in a single room and delivering them pre-arranged content, government officials found a way to distract reporters from snooping around. Such real investigations, after all, could stumble onto authentic stories and leaks, whereas a press conference was a prepackaged content that was inconsequential. To further impede investigative journalism, state conferences are usually held on Fridays. This was, and still is, to discourage comprehensive research and investigation on the part of the reporters, who would rather want to enjoy their weekends. The press conference effectively turned the attending platform to an extension of government propaganda. The end result was prepackaged content that was poorly researched. Still, it satisfied the needs of the public. As yellow journalism and fake news continued to reach audiences, it eventually caused a backlash and accelerated the development of new business plans, journalistic ethics, as well as theories on mass media communication. Many of these advances took place in the United States, which we will cover in the second episode of the Fake News series. For now, this was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. Special thanks to our amazing contributors on Patreon for giving us the resources to produce reports like this. For more information on our crowdfunding platform, visit patreon.com/CaspianReport. All the funds help to make our channel independent from sponsors and advertisers. You can also make one-time donations by cryptocurrencies. See the description for our Ether and Bitcoin addresses. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sarol.